Hey guys, tonight we're sinking into something a little decadent. So go ahead, dim the lights, fluff up the pillows, and maybe grab that cozy blanket that always makes you feel like a burrito of calm. Because tonight, we're gliding through the strange, glittering, and surprisingly depressing afterlives of royal mistresses, the women who once ruled hearts and boudoirs, only to find themselves suddenly out of fashion the moment their king stopped breathing. It's a story that floats somewhere between tragic opera and slow-motion soap opera. The mistresses of kings were once adored, envied, showered with jewels, and whispered about in scandalous court gossip. But what happens when the man who made them powerful stops existing? Well, the answer is usually nothing good. Let's drift back in time and watch a few of them try, and mostly fail, to stay relevant once the crown slipped off their lover's cold head. We should probably start with Madame de Montespan, because of course we should. She was the undisputed it-girl of Louis XIV's court, the Sun King himself. Montespan was witty, beautiful, and had that kind of confident sparkle that made other nobles silently wonder if they should try harder or just give up. She wasn't just a mistress. She was practically an institution. She gave Louis 7 children, which for a royal mistress is basically the same as having a frequent flyer card. But when Louis eventually got bored, and as kings do, decided to cleanse his soul with a sudden burst of religion, Montespan was politely escorted off center stage. Well, politely in that way royal courts specialize in, meaning she was ignored until she got the hint. After Louis's death, Montespan was a footnote. She had retired years earlier to a convent, where she reportedly spent her time donating to charities and looking vaguely annoyed. One courtier said she still carried herself like she was the Queen of France. Only now she was the queen of embroidery circles. It's almost poetic. One day you're dazzling in diamonds, the next you're quietly arguing about soup portions with nuns. Let's float over to Madame du Barry because her exit strategy was, well, not great. She was the last official mistress of Louis XV, and let's just say she had a bit of a PR problem. Unlike Montespan, who at least had some aristocratic family tree to wave around, du Barry had started life as a low-born commoner. This meant that the French court treated her like a very glamorous cockroach, tolerated but never truly accepted. When Louis XV died, du Barry lost everything overnight. There was no pension plan for being charming while draped on a chaise longue. She was politely shoved out of Versailles and told to go be decorative somewhere else. She retreated to a quiet country estate, where she mostly collected pretty things and nervously avoided politics, until the French Revolution rolled around like an enormous blood-stained thundercloud. The revolutionaries were not fans of royal mistresses or anyone who smelled faintly of perfume and monarchy. Du Barry tried to escape to England, which sounds like a solid plan, except she kept sneaking back to fetch more jewelry. Revolutionary authorities noticed, as revolutionary authorities tend to, and eventually she got a very final haircut at the Place de la Révolution. So yeah, du Barry's after the king era went from spa days to guillotine days in record time. But not all post-king lives ended in screaming crowds. Some mistresses managed to pivot, sort of. Take Barbara Villiers, Duchess of Cleveland, one of the more infamous mistresses of Charles II of England. Barbara was basically chaos in a ball gown. She spent her time at court loudly feuding with anyone who looked at her wrong and spending vast amounts of money she didn't actually have. Charles adored her anyway, possibly because he was, at his core, a chaos enthusiast. When Charles died, Barbara didn't exactly fade quietly. She remarried, divorced, married again, and floated around Europe causing expensive problems. By the end of her life, she was reportedly living in relative obscurity, squabbling over debts, and insisting that everyone still call her Your Grace, which they probably did, mostly to escape the room faster. She's one of the rare mistresses who clung to her social gravity long after her royal son burned out. Imagine someone who peaked in the 1660s, but still acts like the party never ended. Then there's Nell Gwyn, another of Charles II's mistresses, and honestly, the only one who seemed to have fun about it. Nell had started as an orange seller and stage actress, so she'd already had a crash course in not taking aristocrats too seriously. Charles adored her, and the public did too, mostly because she was funny and didn't pretend to be a duchess. When Charles died, Nell didn't try to stay at court. She just quietly retired, took care of their surviving son, and enjoyed her wealth until her death. She was probably the closest thing to a happy ending this whole genre of women ever got. Though being England, people still gossiped that she drank too much sherry, which honestly feels like the most harmless accusation in this entire lineup. And because royal drama is never complete without someone being quietly tragic, we have Lola Montez. Technically, Lola wasn't a mistress of a king for long, just of Ludwig Wiffin of Bavaria, who made her a countess because he was very in love, and also very not thinking things through. Lola was a force of nature. She danced scandalous dances, wore scandalous dresses, and made half the Bavarian court want to either duel her or propose. But when Ludwig abdicated under pressure, Lola's power evaporated instantly. The people of Munich literally rioted until she fled. After that, she wandered through Europe and America doing cabaret shows, writing memoirs and occasionally pretending to be Spanish. She was Irish, which made the Spanish thing slightly awkward. Her later life was basically a traveling sideshow of former glory, with Lola fiercely insisting she was still a countess, even as she performed in dusty theaters to small, confused crowds. It's a vibe. And not a happy vibe, but definitely a vibe. If there's a pattern here, it's this. Royal mistresses usually existed only as long as the king's heartbeat did. The moment he stopped breathing, so did their influence. Some retired gracefully into convents. Some tried to cling to court like decorative wallpaper. Some reinvented themselves as wandering eccentric legends. And some, well, ended up on the business end of history's least relaxing haircut. And honestly, it's a strangely lonely story. These women had everything: jewels, silks, palaces, whispered power, and yet it was all rented, not theirs. The second their royal patron was gone, the palace doors quietly closed behind them. There's something almost haunting about that, a kind of glittering exile. All right, settle back in. If you've got tea, let it go lukewarm. That's the ideal temperature for listening to the slow unraveling of glamorous lives. Because in this part, we're gliding further down the tapestry of forgotten royal mistresses, the ones who clung to their former grandeur like a fading perfume. And if you're wondering whether things went better for any of them once the king was gone, no, not really. Let's drift first toward Louise de Querouaille, a woman who managed to annoy an entire kingdom simply by existing in the same room as Charles II of England. Louise was French, which, to the English of the 1670s, was basically like being a walking political scandal in silk. Charles thought she was charming, refined, and a perfect balance to his more chaotic mistresses. The English court thought she was probably a spy sent directly from Versailles in a cloud of perfume. She gave Charles a son, and he gave her titles, money, and the kind of diamond collection that makes modern jewelry heists look underachieving. Then Charles died, and Louise, suddenly very French and very unpopular, quietly packed up her diamonds and fled home to France. She spent the rest of her life as an honored lady at the French court, which sounds nice, until you realize she spent decades mostly reminiscing about her glory days in England like someone who peaked at senior prom. There are letters where she begged, Charles's successor for money, which he mostly ignored, because nothing says your party's over, quite like royal accountants ghosting your letters. Now, slide your gaze toward Agnes Sorel, often called the first official royal mistress of Charles VII of France. Agnes was basically medieval France's answer to a celebrity influencer. She was glamorous, witty, and famously wore gowns so low-cut they made conservative bishops have full theological meltdowns. Charles adored her. He gave her castles, jewels, and political access, because nothing says "I trust you" like handing your girlfriend control of state finances. Then she died suddenly, possibly poisoned at just 28. Charles followed her into the grave a few years later, and their entire glittering world crumbled like stale pastry. Agnes had been buried in a lavish tomb, but once her royal patron was gone, people treated her memory like an embarrassing family secret. Later kings even tried to erase the tradition of having an official mistress, as if the whole thing had been a weird phase France went through. So Agnes's posthumous career was basically silence, no legacy, just an empty tomb with pearls carved on it, quietly collecting dust. And then there's Alice Perez. Alice was the notorious mistress of Edward III of England, and possibly the single most despised woman in medieval England, which is saying something, because medieval England was basically a competitive sport of hating people. She was ambitious, clever, and openly enjoyed wealth in ways that annoyed literally everyone. While Edward was old and sick, she ran around court collecting lands, jewels, and lawsuits like they were Pokemon. Then Edward died, and Parliament immediately had her arrested, stripped of her lands, and thrown out of court in what can only be described as a national exhale of relief. Alice tried to claw her way back into influence, but without Edward she was just a very disliked woman with increasingly fewer friends. She died quietly, wealthy but irrelevant, probably glaring at the memory of every smug duke who ever smirked at her downfall. Now let's gently detour to Catherine Walters, known as Skittles, which was not, sadly, candy-related. She wasn't quite a royal mistress, but she danced very close to that orbit, charming a laundry list of aristocrats and allegedly catching the eye of Edward VII when he was still the Prince of Wales. Skittles lived well off the gifts of her admirers, riding her horse through Hyde Park like a Victorian supermodel. But when her high society lovers either died, married someone respectable, or got distracted by newer scandals, she quietly retired. Her later years were oddly wholesome. She lived off her investments, gardened, and annoyed her neighbors by surviving much longer than anyone expected. When she died, the papers said she was respectable, which is probably the most devastating obituary you can give to someone who once caused traffic jams by existing. And because no story about fading glamour is complete without at least one royal mistress reinventing herself as a tragic philosopher, we have Maintenon, or more formally, Françoise d'Aubigné, Marquise de Maintenon. She began as governess to the children of Louis XIV and his mistress, Madame de Montespan, and then somehow became Louis's secret second wife. Yes, she fully upgraded from employee to queenish. When Louis died, Maintenon didn't even pretend to hang around court. She walked out of Versailles, retired to a convent, and basically became the embodiment of delete social media. Go touch grass. She lived out her days tutoring young girls and writing letters about the emptiness of worldly vanities, which is absolutely what you do after being married to the man who called himself the Sun King. Her story is oddly peaceful, and also feels like the historical equivalent of putting on sweatpants forever. If you're noticing a theme here, it's this. Power borrowed through someone else's crown tends to evaporate the second that crown hits the coffin. One day you're dazzling in candlelight. The next you're hoping your jewels don't get repossessed. Some of these women tried to cling to their past, some escaped into anonymity, and a few just sat in their country houses drinking tea, wondering how it all felt both endless and over so fast. So, where were we? Ah yes, lounging among the faded perfumes and crumpled love letters of royal mistresses who suddenly found themselves not very royal anymore. It's funny, in a slightly tragic way. One day they were the center of candlelit banquets. The next, they were the awkward guest no one invited, but everyone remembers too well. Let's linger here a little longer. There are still a few more lost stars twinkling faintly in the royal night sky. We've already drifted past Louise de Querouaille, the French diamond who slipped quietly back to France after Charles II of England dropped dead. But here's a small detail about her. She spent decades writing letters begging the new king, James II of England, for her pension money. And James, being James, either forgot, ignored her, or just hoped she'd go away. By the end of her life, Louise was living in a crumbling chateau, selling her pearls one by one, like someone slowly listing their old designer handbags on an 18th century version of eBay. It's a quiet sort of heartbreak, the kind where you're still technically rich, but nobody calls anymore. Then there was Barbara Villiers, another blazing comet from Charles II's endlessly chaotic love life. Barbara was bold, scandalous, and had a talent for getting pregnant and getting rewarded for it. Charles gave her titles, houses, and a level of chaos energy that could power a small city. But when Charles died, Barbara's popularity evaporated faster than spilled brandy. She remarried, lost her fortune in messy lawsuits, and ended her life mostly broke, wandering through rented rooms in Paris, loudly telling anyone who'd listen how fabulous she used to be. People humored her, the way you humor that one relative who won't stop talking about their glory days in 1973. And how could we forget Madame de Montespan, arguably the most dazzling of Louis XIV's mistresses? She had everything: beauty, wit, and the ability to make even Versailles look underdecorated. But her downfall came even before Louis died. Rumors tied her to the affair of the poisons, a spectacular scandal involving fortune-tellers, witchcraft, and possibly some light attempted murder. Louis, who once adored her, suddenly decided she was spiritually exhausting. He dumped her with all the ceremony of someone putting away last season's furniture. After he pushed her aside, Montespan retired to a convent, where she spent her days fasting, praying, and, this is real, writing long lists of her past sins. Imagine going from the center of Versailles to apologizing for 20 years straight. That's a crash landing if there ever was one. And then there's Nell Gwyn, everyone's favorite chaos sprite of the English Restoration. Unlike the others, Nell didn't try to cling to court after Charles II died. She knew the music had stopped, and she didn't pretend to still be dancing. She was left a small pension, a house, and just enough goodwill from the public to avoid complete obscurity. She lived quietly, raised her son, and passed away not long after Charles, like a candle flickering out right after the party ends. Oddly enough, people remembered her fondly, probably because she never acted like royalty, just like someone having a spectacularly good time while it lasted. And let's glide, softly, so we don't disturb the ghosts, to Madame du Barry. She was the last official mistress of Louis XV, and she arrived at court like a scandal wrapped in satin. When Louis died, everyone who had politely tolerated her presence instantly decided she was unbearable. She was banished from Versailles overnight, packed off to the countryside like unwanted furniture. Du Barry tried to reinvent herself as a peaceful country lady, collecting art and gardening, but the French Revolution had other plans. When the revolutionaries came, they remembered her as that symbol of royal excess, and let's just say she did not survive the encounter. Her last words were allegedly begging the executioner not to hurt her, which is a bleak but perfect symbol. From golden palaces to begging strangers for kindness, all in a single lifetime. Hey, welcome back. If you're still awake, congratulations. If you're half asleep, even better. Because now we're gliding into the soft, scandalous shadows of royal bedrooms, and we're going to talk about what happened when royal women decided to break every rule written for them. See, for centuries, royal women were basically decorative diplomatic packages, born to glitter in portraits, married off like very expensive houseplants, and expected to quietly produce heirs like perfectly functioning royal vending machines. Romance, personal happiness, emotional fulfillment, yeah. None of that was on the to-do list. Their lives were tightly choreographed, raised in guarded households, escorted by ladies-in-waiting who tattled more than they assisted, and married off in their teens to men decades older. And because dynastic politics were obsessed with pure bloodlines, their bodies were treated as public property. They were national wombs, living vessels of legitimacy. So, of course, the idea that a princess or queen might go off script and actually fall in love with someone of her own choosing, that was considered more dangerous than a peasant uprising, because when a king had a mistress, everyone just sort of sighed and pretended it was fine. It was practically a royal tradition. But if a queen even looked fondly at another man, it was like dropping a torch into a gunpowder cellar. The entire dynasty could theoretically collapse over a glance, and yet love happened anyway, because people are people, even if they're wearing crowns that weigh as much as a small turkey. Isabella of Angoulême, the bored widow who wouldn't behave. Let's start with Isabella of Angoulême. She was married at 12, to King John of England, who was about twice her age and widely considered one of England's worst kings, which is saying something. John was moody, paranoid, and possibly allergic to joy. Isabella's main role was to produce heirs and look queenly, while John lost wars and screamed at his barons. When John died in 1216, Isabella was only about 28. And free, sort of. She returned to her homeland in France and, how to put this politely, started living. She allegedly took multiple lovers, including some of the most powerful nobles in the region. One chronicler described her as possessed by an insatiable carnal fury, which sounds like either slander or the tagline for a medieval soap opera. She also got tangled up in plots against her own son, Henry III of England, and was eventually forced into semi-exile in a convent. There, she died, probably poisoned, possibly by someone tired of her endless chaos. But honestly, at least she wasn't bored. Joanna I of Naples, the queen who refused to be quiet. Then we have Joanna I of Naples, a teenage queen who inherited a glittering Mediterranean kingdom in the 1300s and immediately shocked everyone by having opinions. She married the man chosen for her, Andrew of Hungary, but their relationship was, let's say, chilly.court gossip, claimed Joanna was secretly in love with someone else. When Andrew was mysteriously murdered, strangled during a hunting trip and very subtle, the finger of suspicion pointed straight at Joanna. She denied everything, married another man within the year, and carried on ruling Naples while juggling lovers like a particularly glamorous juggler. Over the decades, she would marry 4 times, survive 2 depositions, and outlive almost everyone who plotted against her. She ruled through plagues, rebellions, and endless papal tantrums. And despite the constant slut-shaming from ambassadors and chroniclers, she remained on the throne for nearly 40 years. Scandalous? Yes. Effective? Also yes. Margaret of Anjou, the battle queen with a bad reputation, and then Margaret of Anjou. Margaret married Henry VI of England, who was gentle, pious, and frequently catatonic. When Henry mentally checked out of reality, Margaret basically took over. She led armies, ran the court, and scared the nobility half to death, which, frankly, was probably the only way to survive during the Wars of the Roses, because of her power. People couldn't imagine she might just be competent, so they decided she must be secretly sleeping with Edmund Beaufort. They said her only son wasn't really Henry's. They said she was a witch. They said she was controlling Henry with dark magic, which is what 15th century men usually said when confronted with a woman who could form a coherent thought. There's no evidence any of it was true, but once gossip like that started, it stuck forever. After Henry's death and her own political downfall, Margaret was exiled to France, broke, grieving, and utterly alone. She had tried to be a warrior queen. History decided to remember her as a scandal. The punishments, so... What actually happened to royal women caught in forbidden love? Well, nothing good. If they were lucky, they were quietly packed off to a convent, told to reflect on their sins, and left to spend the rest of their lives embroidering lilies on altar cloths. Others were imprisoned in remote castles, politely called guest houses, but basically stone cells with better curtains. Sometimes the punishments were deadlier. A suspicious number of queens and princesses died of sudden fevers after being accused of infidelity. Convenient fevers, the kind that came in goblets of wine and didn't leave bruises, and almost always their reputations were obliterated. Chroniclers would erase their names from court records, tear their portraits from galleries, and pretend they had never existed, because what the crown feared most wasn't love. It was the idea that royal women could choose for themselves, the quiet rebels, and yet not all were caught. Some slipped away. There are scattered stories, half whispers, of princesses who fled with lovers in the night, trading crowns for anonymity. They disappeared into distant villages, changed their names, and lived as commoners. History forgot them, but they must have remembered themselves. Imagine them decades later, grey-haired and unknown, tending little gardens, while the world argued over thrones they no longer cared about. They had been royal, they had been scandalous, and then they were free. The aftermath of desire. The saddest part is how many of these women were never allowed to be full people in the history books. They exist only as rumors, footnotes, or cautionary tales, even when their crimes were just being human. Meanwhile, their male counterparts, kings with mistresses stacked like decorative furniture, were celebrated as virile and strong. A king could have 10 illegitimate children and be praised for his vitality. A queen could smile too warmly at the wrong courtier and be accused of treason. It's almost funny, in the bleakest possible way. So when we talk about forbidden love in royal courts, it's not just about romance. It's about resistance. Tiny, doomed acts of rebellion against systems designed to suffocate them. These women weren't trying to topple kingdoms. They were just trying to feel alive for a moment, and sometimes they did. Imagine this. The king is dead. The great bells of the capital toll like thunder rolling across stone rooftops. The court is draped in black silk. Courtiers weep politely, because real grief would ruin their complexions. And there, standing in the velvet shadows of the funeral procession, is the woman no one will name out loud, the king's mistress. She is not invited to the mourning ceremonies. She is not listed in the funeral records. She does not get to wear widow's black, but everyone notices if she cries. And now, with the king gone, her entire world has just evaporated like perfume in cold air, because royal mistresses lived in a strange paradox. They could be dazzling, powerful, and feared while the king lived, and then become invisible, the very moment his heart stopped beating. The rise from nobody to notorious royal mistresses often began as nobodies, minor ladies in waiting, chambermaids, distant cousins of middling nobles. They caught the king's eye, were drawn into his orbit, and suddenly found themselves glowing at the center of power, like gilded moths around a candle. But make no mistake, their power was never truly theirs. It was borrowed, reflected like moonlight off someone else's sun. While the king adored them, they could shape court fashion, whisper names into royal appointments, even influence treaties. Entire economies tilted around their whims. Courtiers bribed them for favors. Artists painted them as goddesses, yet every single one of them knew the unspoken rule. Their power had an expiration date, and that date was the king's death, the fall. When the crown stops protecting when the king died, his successor, usually the queen's son, almost always hated the mistress. She represented everything unstable, embarrassing, and disloyal about the old reign. She was a living reminder that the late king had preferred someone else over his queen. And that couldn't be tolerated in the pristine new regime, so within days or even hours of the funeral, the purge would begin. Guards arrived at her door and confiscated her royal gifts, the jewels, the estates, the titles that were technically always the crown's property. She was evicted from her palace apartments, sometimes with dignity, sometimes by force. The new court would circulate pamphlets calling her a witch, a harlot, or worse, irrelevant, and just like that, the most powerful woman at court could find herself living in a drafty country manor with nothing but faded gowns and unpaid servants. While her former enemies toasted her downfall in candlelit halls, Barbara Palmer, first Duchess of Cleveland, the survivor who refused to vanish. One of the most notorious examples is Barbara Palmer, first Duchess of Cleveland, the favorite mistress of Charles II of England. Barbara was beautiful, temperamental, and terrifyingly ambitious. While Charles lived, she essentially ran half the court. He showered her with jewels, estates, and titles. She had 5 of his children, all richly provided for. But when Charles died in 1685, her power evaporated overnight. His brother, James II of England, despised her. Barbara was forced out of court, stripped of influence, and left scrambling to hold on to what wealth she could, and yet she didn't crumble. Barbara moved to France, schemed her way into advantageous marriages for her children, and lived for decades as a grand old scandal, still dripping in diamonds and refusing to be forgotten. While most mistresses faded, she roared, Madame de Montespan, the star who fell into silence. Then there was Madame de Montespan, once the glittering favorite of Louis XIV of France. For over a decade, she was the unofficial Queen of Versailles, witty, magnetic, and feared. Ministers courted her favor. Poets compared her to goddesses. She bore the king's 7 children and lived in unimaginable luxury. But even before Louis's death, her power began to crumble. A witchcraft scandal known as the Affair of the Poisons tarnished her name, and the king quietly replaced her with the meeker Madame de Maintenon. By the time Louis died, Montespan had been pushed out completely. She spent her final years in a convent, fasting and praying, the once mighty Queen of Hearts now scrubbing floors in silence. Her downfall was so complete that later generations almost forgot she had once ruled the French court by sheer charisma. The dangers they faced. Some mistresses were even accused of murder or treason once their protector died. Because they had seen everything, the secrets, the schemes, the whispered plots, they were considered walking liabilities. So, to tidy things up, some new regimes preferred them dead. Suspicious number of royal mistresses died suddenly. In the months after a king's death, often of vague fevers or nervous collapses, their letters were destroyed, their portraits removed, their names erased from ledgers. Even when they survived, they lived under constant threat. Lawsuits from the crown to reclaim gifts, debts called in by creditors who had been too afraid to ask earlier, and exile from polite society. They were ghosts haunting a palace that had no room for ghosts, the clever escapes, and yet a few outwitted everyone. Some mistresses used their final years with the king to prepare escape plans. They converted jewels into cash, bought estates under false names, and married loyal minor nobles who would protect them once the crown turned cold. A few even pivoted to religion, cloaking themselves in piety to disarm public hatred. Others fled to distant courts, Italy, Spain, Austria, where their notoriety became an exotic kind of fame, and they reinvented themselves as mysterious widows from another world. It wasn't survival as they had known it, but it was survival. The quiet ending, the most haunting part, is how many of these women simply faded. They went from glittering at the center of power to dying in lonely obscurity. Their names mentioned only in scandalous footnotes. When they were alive, they were described as temptresses, enchantresses, even destroyers of kingdoms. But when they were gone, history barely whispered them at all, because power borrowed from someone else's love is always temporary. And when that love ends, so does the power, what they teach us. So what does all this mean? It means that in the glittering cruelty of royal courts, even the brightest stars could be snuffed out the moment they lost their source of light. Mistresses lived on borrowed glory, and when the king died, they became reminders of a story no one wanted told anymore. And yet, for a brief time, they had ruled without crowns. They bent kings to their will. They shaped empires with whispers and laughter, and smiles that could turn policy into poetry. Even if history forgot their names, the echoes of their rebellion still shimmer faintly in palace halls. Royal children who were never meant to exist. Imagine the hush of a palace nursery at night. The silk curtains are drawn, a single candle trembles on a gilded table, and in a carved cradle, wrapped in lace finer than spiderwebs, lies the quietest scandal in the entire kingdom, a royal child, but not the right kind, because this isn't the heir or even a spare. This is the secret child, the whispered about little soul who arrived thanks to a king's wandering affections, or a queen's desperate gamble, or one of those endless, candlelit court intrigues that everyone pretends not to see. They weren't supposed to exist, and yet there they were, small, fragile, and inconveniently real, conceived in secrets. Born in silence, royal courts were obsessed with legitimacy. Bloodlines had to be clean, documented, and preferably dripping with centuries of titles. Every heir had to be unquestionably royal, or risk plunging the entire kingdom into chaos, which meant that when a king's mistress or a noble lady-in-waiting turned up pregnant, everyone quietly panicked. The usual solution? Secrecy, and lots of it. Pregnant mistresses would go on holiday to distant estates. The baby would be born behind closed curtains, often registered under false names. The mother might adopt her own child later, or pass it off as her niece or goddaughter. Sometimes the child was whisked away to be raised by trusted families far from court, never told who their real parents were. In a world where names were everything, these children had none, just shadows of whispers trailing behind them. The king's bastards. Let's be honest, kings had a lot of illegitimate children, and while most were quietly erased from history, a few were too obvious or too politically useful to ignore. These royal bastards existed in a strange limbo, undeniably royal by blood, yet legally considered nobodies. Take Charles II of England again. He had no legitimate heirs at all, but at least a dozen illegitimate ones. He openly acknowledged many of them, giving them titles like Duke of Monmouth, Duke of Grafton, Duke of St. Albans, basically turning bastardy into a side hustle for the nobility. Of course, this also meant his mistresses used their children as bargaining chips. The more royal kids they produced, the more secure their position became. A little like insurance policies, except with more lace bonnets. But there was always a catch. The moment the king died, these children's positions collapsed, because bastards could never inherit the throne, and with their father gone they became politically useless. Some were given generous pensions and gently pushed out of sight. Others were stripped of everything and left to drift in quiet disgrace. A few even tried to claim the crown anyway, which almost always ended badly. James Scott, 1st Duke of Monmouth, the bastard who tried to be King James Scott. 1st Duke of Monmouth was the eldest and favourite illegitimate son of Charles II of England. He was handsome, dashing and dangerously convinced he deserved the throne. When Charles died without a legitimate heir, Monmouth staged the Monmouth Rebellion in 1685 to seize power from his uncle, James II of England. It did not go well. Monmouth's army collapsed and he was captured, pleading pathetically for mercy before being executed on Tower Hill. His death was gruesome, botched by an incompetent executioner, a grim end for a boy who grew up thinking he might be king. He's a perfect example of how illegitimate royal children could be both glorified and doomed. Raised to believe they were special, yet never allowed to truly be what they were told they were. Hidden heirs and suspicious births. Sometimes the opposite problem happened. A royal child was born legitimate. But nobody believed it, because when a queen gave birth, there was always the lurking fear that the child wasn't actually the king's. In the 1600s and 1700s especially, royal childbirth was treated like a state event. Dozens of witnesses crowded into the Queen's chambers to watch the delivery. Yes, literally watch. Just to confirm the baby actually came from her body and hadn't been swapped in from somewhere else. Even then, suspicions lingered. Rumors about illegitimacy could haunt royal children for their entire lives, weakening their claims and making them political pawns in every coup. Rebellion and inheritance dispute, and of course, sometimes the rumors were true. Louis XIV of France, the king who hid his children in plain sight. Louis XIV of France was a master at turning illegitimate children into political tools. He had over a dozen with various mistresses, including Madame de Montespan, and he did something bold. He openly acknowledged them, then married them off to legitimate nobles to weave them into the royal bloodline like decorative golden thread. This horrified the traditional aristocracy, who saw it as polluting the royal line. But Louis didn't care. He even gave some of them princely titles, effectively saying, yes, they're my bastards, and what are you going to do about it? It worked, sort of. His acknowledged bastards never inherited the throne. But their descendants married into Europe's highest families, quietly seeding half the continent with sneaky off-brand Bourbon DNA, the children who disappeared. For every acknowledged royal bastard, there were many more who simply disappeared. They were quietly sent away, their births scrubbed from records. Sometimes they were raised in monasteries, or tucked into minor noble households as wards, or shipped off to distant colonies with generous dowries, and no questions asked. Some never learned who they truly were. Others were told the truth only in hushed deathbed confessions. Like a Gothic plot twist nobody was allowed to acknowledge. These vanished children lived in the shadows of history, unrecorded yet undeniably real, living proof that power and shame were often two sides of the same crown. When they tried to come back every now and then, one of these hidden children would reappear as an adult, claiming their royal parentage, usually when there was a succession crisis and they saw an opening. It almost never worked. Courts loathed uncertainty. Claimants without flawless documentation were treated as frauds, even if they actually were royal. Many were imprisoned, exiled, or just quietly ignored until they gave up. Some lived out their days bitter and broke, wandering taverns with old letters and rings as proof that no one wanted to see. The crown was happy to use their blood when it was convenient, and just as happy to deny them when it wasn't. Why they mattered anyway. And yet these unwanted children shaped history in subtle ways. They created dynastic webs that spanned rival houses. They carried royal blood into unexpected places, blending lineages that had been fiercely guarded. Their existence forced kings to bend laws, write new succession rules, and rethink what made someone royal in the first place. Even if they weren't supposed to exist, they quietly rewrote what royalty meant, simply by being born. The lonely reality, but behind the intrigue and scandal, most of them were just lonely, raised in splendor but not quite belonging, worshipped or hidden, praised or erased, but never simply loved as themselves. They were told they were special, and also told they could never be what they were born as. Their lives were contradictions stitched together with silk thread, and when they died, the world often sighed in relief. One less dangerous question lingering in the bloodline, the quiet echo even now, centuries later. Their stories ripple faintly through old letters and family trees, hidden behind blank spaces where their names should be. They were ghosts from the start, children who carried the weight of crowns they could never wear, and yet, in their strange, fragile way, they remind us how much of royal history was built on secrets, and how easily entire bloodlines could be forgotten if they weren't convenient enough to remember. Pensions, pearls, and petty politics. Hey, welcome back. If you've made it this far, congratulations. You've officially listened to more royal heartbreak than most historians can tolerate without lying down. So, let's dim the imaginary candlelight and float gently into the next sleepy corridor of this story, the aftermath. Because what happens when the king dies, and his favorite mistress doesn't? It's an oddly delicate moment. One day, she's the glittering centerpiece of the court, the woman everyone flatters, fears, or gossips about behind elaborately painted fans. And the next day, she's a leftover, a human bookmark in someone else's reign. She's not a queen. She's not family. She's just a reminder. Awkward, inconvenient, and suddenly in the way. And the royal court, which used to orbit around her every smile, now treats her like a piece of antique furniture nobody quite wants to throw away. But nobody wants to dust either. Let's drift for a moment to Madame de Montespan, mistress of Louis XIV, the original drama magnate of Versailles. While she reigned as chief mistress, she practically was the French court. She curated its fashion, steered its gossip, and allegedly whispered political advice between kisses. She bore the Sun King's 7 children, which is either romantic or exhausting, depending on how you feel about diaper logistics in 17th century France. But after years of dazzling the court, she slipped from favor. The magic wore off, and everyone who used to cling to her skirts like decorative ivy suddenly discovered urgent appointments elsewhere. Yet she didn't vanish. Not at first. Instead, Montespan hung around the palace like a scandal-shaped chandelier no one could quite remove. She still drew a royal pension, attended select events, and wore diamonds big enough to double as paperweights. As if nothing had changed, people whispered, but very quietly, because she still knew things. Eventually, under a soft cloud of polite pressure, she retreated to a convent, the historical equivalent of going offline. Only she didn't go humbly. She brought with her a personal chef, several wagons of gold furniture, and the firm belief that she was still, in every way that mattered, the center of the universe. Honestly, you have to respect the consistency. Not all mistresses accepted quiet exile, though. Some refused to step aside at all. Madame de Pompadour, mistress of Louis XV, is the gold medal example here. When their romantic relationship cooled, she didn't slink away. She simply rebranded herself as his confidant, which, translated from Versailles, meant she stayed in power, without technically being in his bed. Pompadour orchestrated art commissions, manipulated diplomatic appointments, designed palace interiors, and even had her own porcelain factory. In other words, she turned post-romance survival into an entire industry, while newer, younger mistresses came and went like seasonal decorations. Pompadour remained in her elegant corner of the palace for nearly 2 decades, sipping chocolate, running the cultural life of France, and pretending not to notice that her power came entirely from not being replaced. It was less a love affair, more a lifelong brand partnership. And then there were the clever escape artists, the ones who used their fame to quietly build safety nets before the king's heart, or heartbeat, stopped. Barbara Villiers, the tempestuous mistress of Charles II of England, is a prime case. She collected estates, jewels, pensions, and titles with the single-minded determination of someone building a bunker out of diamonds. When Charles died, she didn't collapse. She simply switched gears, renting out her estates, hosting private salons, and even marrying again, mostly for financial insulation, which she didn't bother to hide. She no longer had a crown-shaped spotlight on her, but she continued to glide through society like someone who might still have the king's diary hidden in a desk drawer somewhere. And honestly, maybe she did. But for every woman who thrived, there were several who sank fast, because mistresses were never legally secure. They were lavishly rewarded when useful, and instantly disposable when the king's successor wanted to make a point. And new kings loved making points. The easiest way to announce, "I am nothing like the old king," was to publicly exile his mistress, preferably to some drafty estate where she could wither quietly among her fading gowns. Some were stripped of their pensions overnight. Some were politely told they could retire, which was code for "please vanish before we change the locks." And some didn't even get that courtesy. They woke up to find their staff dismissed, their jewels confiscated, and their letters ignored. A few ended up in humiliating debt, pawning their silks to pay for coal, selling their furniture piece by piece, living in genteel squalor while the court tried to pretend they'd never existed. They had dined with kings, and now they couldn't afford dinner. Others tried to outplay the system by holding on to secrets. Royal mistresses often knew everything. Who was plotting what? Who was secretly broke? Who had that embarrassing medical condition nobody talked about? And some used that information like currency. They made quiet deals with ministers, bartered influence for protection, hinted that they might write their memoirs if certain pensions weren't renewed. It was subtle blackmail disguised as nostalgia. Many of them succeeded, slipping into comfortable old age on estates quietly funded by governments that found it cheaper to keep them happy than risk their stories escaping. And then there were the ones who simply chose to disappear. They went from ballrooms to flower gardens, from orchestras playing when they entered a room, to no one remembering their name. Some married minor nobles and reinvented themselves as demure country ladies. Others joined religious orders, trading silk for wool and court intrigue for the comforting monotony of prayer bells. It sounds bleak, but many seemed content, maybe even relieved, to stop performing, because being a royal mistress was never peaceful. It was exhausting, precarious, and endlessly theatrical. Every smile was strategic, every glance calculated, every step along a razor's edge of favor and disgrace. And when the king died, so did the stage. The curtains fell. The audience went home. All that remained was the question, Who are you when no one's watching anymore? For many of them, the answer was, finally, just themselves. He bastard problem. So, the king is gone. His mistress has been politely sent to a quiet country estate with far too many peacocks. The court is moving on. But what about the children, those half-royal, half-awkward little humans who had the king's nose, the king's temper, and absolutely none of his legal status? They were the royal equivalent of forgotten bookmarks, undeniably part of the story, but never meant to be on display. And when their powerful father died, the world could suddenly become very chilly, because technically they were nobody. Let's drift back to Charles II of England, a monarch who basically turned illegitimacy into a sport. He had, well, somewhere around 14 illegitimate children, possibly more. The official count wobbles, mostly because people stopped trying to keep track after a while. Not one of them could inherit the throne, but Charles adored them. He handed out dukedoms and earldoms like royal party favours. James Scott, 1st Duke of Monmouth, was the most famous. Tall, glamorous, and constantly surrounded by people who thought he should be king, which made him a political headache wrapped in velvet. When Charles died, Monmouth decided he might as well take a shot at the crown. He led a rebellion. It failed, and he ended up beheaded in what might be history's least successful job interview. Most of Charles's other illegitimate children stayed out of politics, living pleasantly on the generous fortunes their father had arranged, because Charles had the foresight to know that being rich was the only real armor they'd get. But not every royal father was so considerate. Across the Channel, Louis XIV of France also scattered illegitimate offspring around like confetti at a very exclusive masquerade. He officially acknowledged many of them, which was both generous and, honestly, very on-brand. Louis never did anything halfway. These children were given titles, lands, and arranged marriages that stitched them neatly into the lesser nobility. It was the courtly version of putting the family secrets in very fancy boxes. But here's the catch. Their futures were only secure while Louis lived. After his death, his successors viewed those bastard princes with suspicion, as living reminders of the Sun King's excesses. Some were pushed to the political sidelines, their fortunes trimmed down, their ceremonial roles quietly erased. A few fought back with charm, others with lawsuits. Some simply faded into comfortable irrelevance, which, in the world of Versailles, was probably the happiest ending they could hope for. Not everyone got even that. Many royal mistresses' children weren't acknowledged at all. They were whisked away at birth to remote estates or convent schools, their paternity an open secret that nobody dared mention in writing. Their mothers might receive a discreet stipend to raise them, or might be forced to surrender them entirely. Like returning a borrowed book, the library pretends it never lent. These children grew up watching the royal court from a distance, like lonely planets orbiting a sun that never noticed them. And when the king died, any small protections they had usually vanished with him. No pensions, no titles, no access. Just silence, and the lingering sense that they were ghosts of a story that had moved on without them. But there were exceptions, some surprisingly warm ones. Henrietta Fitzjames, one of the illegitimate daughters of James II of England, grew up adored and well provided for, married off to a wealthy noble, and lived in comfort long after her father's fall from the throne. Her success had less to do with her father's ongoing support, which after his exile wasn't much, and more to do with her charm and her mother's careful networking. It was a reminder that, for many of these children, survival depended on how skillfully their mothers played the game. Because titles were nice, but well-placed allies were better, And then there were the ones who became awkward political chess pieces. In the cutthroat dynastic world of Europe, even illegitimate royal children could be useful. They could be married off to minor nobility in exchange for loyalty. They could be planted in the military, where their royal blood made them symbols of glory, while their illegitimacy kept them safely out of the succession. Some became bishops, generals, or diplomats. A few even outshone their legitimate cousins, which caused endless private grumbling at court, because nothing irritated royals quite like being less talented than the supposed mistakes. Still, almost all of them shared one thing: a permanent quiet uncertainty. They had royal blood, but not royal futures, their entire lives balanced on the goodwill of monarchs who might change their minds at breakfast. A single scandal, a single rumor, or just the passage of time could erase their status overnight. And when their fathers died, many learned, abruptly, that they'd been living on borrowed sunlight all along, and somewhere out there, scattered across dusty family trees, these half-forgotten branches still linger. Their names faded. Their portraits tucked into museum storage rooms. They were once whispered about in gilded corridors. Now they're footnotes. But once, for a brief and glittering moment, they were the visible shadows of kings. In our next part, we'll drift to a new question: what the queens thought about all of this. Because while mistresses and their children were scrambling for survival, the widowed queens were quietly deciding just how much revenge they could get away with and still be considered dignified. Spoiler: quite a lot. Many executioners, having spent years mastering their grim craft, began to see themselves not only as enforcers of the law, but as indispensable public servants whose presence alone deterred chaos. In their own strange way, they often saw their role as protective. They believed their work maintained order, spared the innocent, and sent a message to the wicked that justice was always watching. Because of this self-image, some executioners took great pride in cultivating an air of dark mystique. They might wear distinctive clothing, carry ominous tools even when off-duty, or walk through marketplaces in silence so that people would part before them like water around a stone. This cultivated fear ensured that few dared challenge them or gossip too loudly about their private lives. Yet behind this intimidating image, their personal lives remained deeply complicated. Executioners often married within their own kind, forming dynasties of executioners where fathers trained sons and sometimes even daughters in the family trade. These family ties created small isolated clans within towns, respected for their usefulness, yet feared for their craft. Some families kept meticulous secret manuals of technique: how to swing cleanly, how to dull the pain swiftly, and even how to use certain herbs or cordials to calm a trembling prisoner before the blow. Still, the burden of their work gnawed at them. The psychological toll was immense, though they rarely spoke of it. After carrying out executions, some would retreat into long bouts of solitude, avoiding crowds or laughter, as if joy itself had become foreign. Others turned to heavy drinking or carousing as a way to silence the echoes of the condemned in their minds. There are scattered records of executioners who confessed to priests in secret, begging for absolution, while knowing the church often refused to grant it to those who shed blood for a living. And yet, there were moments of quiet humanity too. A few known accounts describe executioners secretly giving coins to the families of those they executed, or ensuring a condemned man's body was buried decently rather than left on the gallows. Such gestures were rarely spoken of, for showing compassion could tarnish their hard-earned aura of terror. But in these rare moments, they revealed the paradox that haunted them. They were human, asked to live as if they were not. The escape from the noose's shadow, how medieval executioners tried to flee their own bloody lives. There comes a moment, often unmarked, unnoticed by the world, when the weight of death becomes heavier than the executioner's hands can carry. For years, these men had been the instruments of law and fear. They had watched heads roll into straw baskets, heard the last gasps of the condemned, smelled the sharp iron tang of blood that never seemed to wash off their skin, and yet they were still human. They had hearts that could tremble. They had minds that could shatter. And eventually some of them broke. The first cracks in the masket usually began quietly, not with rebellion or sudden refusal, but with silence. Long silences where the executioner would stare at the gallows as if seeing it for the first time. Some found themselves unable to eat after an execution, their hands trembling as they tried to hold a spoon. Others woke screaming from dreams where the condemned turned to look at them, mouths still moving, though their heads were gone. Their children noticed. Their wives whispered. Neighbors grew wary, and inside them a single thought began to bloom like a poisonous flower. I can't do this anymore. But they could not simply walk away. An executioner was bound to his office, often by oath, by law, and by fear. Abandoning the post was considered a crime, a betrayal of the crown itself. If they fled openly, they could be hunted down as deserters or even executed themselves. So, the few who dared to leave had to do it in secret, disappearing into the dark. There are faint traces in old parish records, scattered like bones in forgotten earth, of executioners who simply vanished. They would slip away in the night, taking only what they could carry, a few coins, a whetstone, maybe a single keepsake. Sometimes they took their families. Sometimes they left them behind for safety, never to see them again. They would travel by back roads and forgotten tracks, avoiding inns where their faces might be recognized. At the first market town they reached, they would invent a new name: Ulrich the farmer, Peter the smith, Hans the tanner. Their old identity, the one whispered in fear, had to die if they were ever to live. And yet, escape was never simple. Their hands betrayed them. Farmers noticed how easily they handled blades. Smiths wondered why their hammer blows were so precise, so surgical. Children sometimes ran from them without knowing why, sensing something cold in their presence. They could change their names, their work, their clothing, but not the way their eyes lingered too long on necks and wrists, as if measuring invisible lines. From death-bringers to healers, some executioners tried a different path. They did not run. Instead, they attempted to transform their terrible knowledge into something good. You see, executioners understood the human body in ways few others did. They knew how skin tore, how bone snapped, how muscle bled. This gruesome expertise could be inverted, used not to destroy but to repair. So a handful of them became healers. They began sewing wounds instead of severing them, setting broken bones instead of breaking them. They brewed poultices, applied leeches, even attempted crude surgeries. In an age when trained physicians were rare and costly, the poor sometimes welcomed these strange healing hangmen. But their new path was never free of suspicion. Mothers whispered prayers when they entered. Men spat on the ground as they passed. And if a patient died, and even from illness, the old rumors returned at once. Of course they died. Death follows him. It always has. Still, some of these men quietly saved lives, as if trying to balance invisible scales that could never truly be even. Seeking refuge in faith, others, unable to heal their souls with worldly work, turned to heaven. It was not uncommon for an aging executioner to disappear into a monastery. They would shave their heads, don the plain robes of a lay brother, and vow to spend the rest of their lives in silence and prayer. To the world, they became ghosts, figures moving silently in candlelit cloisters, sweeping stone floors, tending herb gardens, copying sacred texts with careful hands that once swung axes. But even there the shadow followed them. Monks wrote in their journals of brothers who woke screaming at night, or who wept silently during the chanting of the psalms. Some flinched at the sound of the bell, as if it were the tolling of the death knell. They had left the world of death behind, yet carried it inside them, becoming guardians of mercy. And then there were the rarest of all, those who stayed in the world, but tried to rewrite their legacy. Having spent decades as instruments of punishment, some executioners used their feared reputation to beg for mercy on behalf of others. They would petition magistrates to grant pardons to petty thieves, beg lords to commute death sentences, or secretly help prisoners escape before their day of execution arrived. Their voices, once used to announce the condemned, became voices pleading for life. Ironically, it was their very infamy that gave them influence. Nobles listened because these were men who knew death intimately. When a hangman said, "This man does not deserve to die," people shuddered, and sometimes agreed it was a strange, lonely redemption, one that rarely erased their guilt, but at least softened it. The curse that never lifted, but here lies the deepest tragedy. No matter where they ran or what they became, the past never let go, even if they found peace for a while, tilling quiet fields, tending sick children, praying in stone chapels. The memories always came back. The sound of the crowd chanting, the hiss of the blade, the moment of silence after the rope snapped taut. Many grew old alone, refusing even to speak of what they once were. Their children sometimes never learned the truth until after their deaths, when an old warrant or blood-stained axe head was found buried in a chest, and even then, their graves were often left unmarked. The villagers feared that naming them might invite their ghosts back, so they lay forgotten, their bones crumbling in the same earth as the men and women they once condemned. As if death had finally made them equals. A legacy of shadows today. When we look back at these faded scraps of history, they appear almost unreal, like figures from some dark fairy tale, but they were real. They lived, loved, and feared, and they tried in their final years to lay down the blade that had ruled their lives. Some succeeded, some did not, yet all of them carried the same silent burden to their graves, the knowledge that though the world might forget their names, their hands would always remember. Ghosts of the gallows, how society remembered dead executioners. There's something strangely poetic about how medieval towns treated their dead hangmen. They feared them when alive, and feared them even more once they were gone. It's as if people thought the executioner's spirit might clock out of work, and then clock back in from beyond the grave, because sure, they were gone, but what if they weren't? Buried like outcasts, or not at all. Most people in the Middle Ages were obsessed with where they were buried. It mattered enormously. Being buried on holy ground meant your soul had a chance at the whole heavenly after-party. Being buried outside the churchyard meant, well, let's just say your RSVP got lost. Executioners were rarely welcome in consecrated soil, even if they'd served the crown loyally for decades. Even if they'd executed hundreds of people by the book, the church still often considered them tainted, because they shed blood, repeatedly and with intention, and so, when they died, they were usually buried in weird, liminal places, the edges of cemeteries near gallows hills, or in lonely fields where criminals had once been dumped. A few were even left unburied for days, until someone worked up the courage or got paid enough to shovel them under, which is kind of ironic, considering they had done their job to the letter, while half the respectable nobles who judged them were busy secretly poisoning cousins for inheritances. But morality has always been more about vibes than logic. Graves that no one visited. The graves of executioners were not places of mourning. They were warnings, no flowers, no prayers, just the wind moving through weeds. Some medieval chroniclers noted that people avoided even walking too close to the grave, as if the ground might still be contagious. In a few towns, the burial site of the executioner was never marked at all. The location was deliberately forgotten, the grave allowed to sink and vanish. The idea was simple. If we forget him, maybe he'll forget us too. Sometimes that superstition worked a little too well. Centuries later, farmers ploughing old fields occasionally turned up strange bone fragments with rusted manacles nearby, and whispered, "Ah, one of his kind." They would rebury the remains quickly, quietly, without crosses. Ghost stories for children and grown-ups who pretended not to believe. Of course, when you erase someone, they don't disappear. They become a story, and medieval towns loved stories, especially ones that kept children indoors after dark. So the dead executioner became a bogeyman. Parents would say, "Go to bed or the hangman will come for you." Nurses would whisper, "Don't wander past the crossroads at midnight. That's where he walks." In some places, people claimed the ghost of the old executioner would walk the gallows hill on stormy nights, dragging a phantom rope behind him. Others said he appeared headless, still holding his own axe, looking for someone to finish the job. And the funny thing is, even the adults half believed it. They didn't say it out loud, of course. But when the wind howled around the old gallows tree, even the bravest men quickened their steps a little. Because you can mock superstition while still locking your door. The curse of the executioner's tools. Even the things they left behind became suspect. Axes, ropes, blocks, and swords that had belonged to executioners were believed to carry curses. Some towns buried the tools along with the man. Others burned them, just in case his spirit might try to pick them up again. There's one account from 15th century Nuremberg where a condemned man's blood splashed onto the executioner's sword. After the executioner died, people swore the sword glowed faintly red at night, like it still remembered. Did it? Probably not. But it's such a good story that you kind of want it to be true. And that's the point. Logic didn't matter. The people needed these objects to be evil, so they could distance themselves from the man who used them. If the sword was cursed, then they weren't complicit. If the axe was haunted, then they hadn't cheered while it fell. Erased from the records, one of the strangest things about medieval executioners is how deliberately invisible they became in death. Town chronicles would list births, marriages, deaths, and just quietly skip them. It's as if they were erased from history while their graves were still warm. This wasn't accidental. It was policy. Because writing their names meant admitting they had existed, and people desperately wanted to pretend they hadn't. Some cities even destroyed the employment records of former executioners after they died. So their line just ended. No pension, no name, no memorial. You can almost hear the civic council saying, "Problem solved. Don't speak of him again." It was a kind of posthumous exile, the final punishment, given after they could no longer defend themselves. The few who were remembered, sort of. There were, however, a few rare exceptions. In places like Paris or London, where executioners had been famous public figures, some left behind strange legacies. One, Jack Ketch in 17th century England, became notorious for botching executions, so much so that centuries later, a real Jack Ketch job still means something done clumsily. Not exactly a flattering memorial, but hey, it's more than most got. Another, Franz Schmidt of Nuremberg, actually kept a detailed diary of every execution he performed. He later became a respected healer, and strangely enough, he was buried honorably. His diary still survives. which is almost suspiciously wholesome for someone who decapitated people for a living, but these were exceptions that proved the rule. Most executioners slid into silence like stones into water. The ripples faded, the surface stilled, and no one spoke their names again. A legacy of fear, not memory, and so the executioner's greatest punishment wasn't death, it was oblivion. When they were alive, everyone knew their name, and shouted it in either fear or fury. When they were dead, no one dared speak it at all. Their houses were abandoned and left to rot. Their children quietly changed surnames. Their graves grew weeds, then disappeared entirely, and yet every town still remembered them, not as people but as a feeling, that little prickle at the back of your neck when you pass an old scaffold site. That urge to whisper in graveyards, that chill when a door creaks at midnight, that's their real monument. Not stone, not names, just the lingering unease they left behind. The hangman's shadow, it's almost beautiful in a sad way. They spent their whole lives erasing others from the world, and the world repaid them in kind. Even now, centuries later, when we find fragments of their lives in dusty archives, we don't remember them as men. We remember them as shadows, nameless, faceless, and somehow still standing behind us, even though they've been gone for hundreds of years. So next time you wander past an old churchyard and feel the hairs on your neck rise, maybe don't look too hard, because it might just be nothing, or it might be the executioner, still checking who's next. Born under the Black Hood, the families of the executioners. If being an executioner was lonely, being their child was like growing up on a deserted island, right in the middle of a bustling city because no one wanted to touch them literally. Children of executioners were often avoided, as though they carried an invisible plague. Their classmates wouldn't play with them. Their neighbors crossed the street when they passed, and yet, paradoxically, these families kept producing executioners for centuries. How? Because the only people who would marry an executioner were usually the daughters of other executioners. A profession that ran in the blood medieval Europe was a world obsessed with professions staying in the family. Bakers' sons became bakers, smiths' sons became smiths, but for executioners this was less tradition and more entrapment, because once your father's name was stained, no respectable guild would take you. No merchant wanted you as an apprentice. No knightly order would even consider it, and so the children had two choices: live in poverty forever or take the family job and wear the hood. Most chose the hood, and thus entire dynasties of executioners quietly formed, hidden threads stitched into the underbelly of medieval society. The executioner clans of France and Germany in France. Several infamous families held the job for generations. The Sanson family served as royal executioners for over 150 years, through revolution and regime change, from the 1600s to the 1800s. In Germany, the Franz Schmidt line lasted for decades in Nuremberg. Franz himself executed more than 300 people, and yet later became a respected healer, while his sons quietly carried on the work. These families often lived in the same secluded houses for generations, their children raised on lullabies of the scaffold. Their tools were passed down like heirlooms, an axe in place of a cradle gift. They weren't celebrated. They weren't honored, but they were needed. And that made them dangerously permanent. Marriage markets of the damned finding a spouse was complicated. Respectable families refused to marry their daughters into blood work. So executioners usually married other social outcasts, lepers, grave diggers, knackers, or most often, the daughters of fellow executioners. These marriages were less about romance, more about survival. They created closed circles of pariah bloodlines, where the stigma never diluted because it never escaped. In some places, Towns even forced executioners to marry only within certain unclean families to keep the social taint contained. It was social quarantine disguised as matrimony, and yet within these families there was often fierce loyalty, because the world hated them, but inside their homes they were the only people who saw each other as human. Children of the gallows, imagine being a child whose father's job is to kill people. Imagine knowing your classmates' parents spit when they say your name. Many children of executioners grew up deeply isolated. They were banned from guilds, excluded from fairs, and even denied baptism in some regions, because priests considered them tainted. Some children snapped under the weight. They ran away, changed their names, tried to vanish into the wider world. A few succeeded. Most didn't, because stigma follows silently. People whispered. Old rumors surfaced, and sooner or later someone would point and say, "Isn't that the hangman's boy?" A golden cage oddly. Executioners were often well paid. Cities knew the job was poisonous to the soul, so they compensated in coin. Families of executioners sometimes lived in surprising comfort. Good food, sturdy homes, nice clothes. But this wealth was its own trap. It made them resented. It made them conspicuous. And it made escaping the job harder, because abandoning it meant abandoning security in a world where most people starved. So the children often stood on a strange bridge, loved and provided for at home, hated and feared by everyone else, trying to break the chain. Some families desperately tried to leave the profession behind. They forged false birth records. They fled to other cities. They bribed guilds to accept their sons as apprentices under fake names. But the stain lingered. A slip of the tongue, a loose rumor, an old neighbor recognizing them, and it all collapsed. Once discovered, they were dragged back into the only life they were fit for, and the chain continued. The vanishing of names because of this stigma. Many descendants of executioners destroyed their own family histories. They burned diaries. They altered gravestones. They erased surnames so their children could grow up without the shadow of the axe overhead. It's why today tracing executioner bloodlines is almost impossible. Entire families disappeared from the paper trail on purpose. They didn't just want freedom. They wanted forgetting, blood that wouldn't wash away. And yet, even centuries later, in tiny European towns, there are whispered stories of families with the mark. Old people murmur about certain surnames that used to belong to hangmen. A lingering wariness, passed down like superstition, as if blood could echo across generations, as if the noose still remembered. The forgotten years behind prison walls extended. As the courtroom doors closed and the thunder of public outrage faded into distant whispers, the world of these captured female pirates shrank into something far smaller, far colder. Stone walls and iron bars. For many, this was the most cruel part of their story. Not the threat of execution, but the endless days of nothingness that followed. Imagine a woman who once commanded a ship, slicing through roaring waves, now trapped in a cell barely wider than her outstretched arms. At first, the authorities were obsessed with them. Jailers came to stare, clergymen came to convert, and curious nobles visited just to glimpse these monsters who had dared to live like men. They were questioned endlessly, about hidden treasure, about secret pirate codes, about their lovers and mutinies. But soon, silence time became their greatest enemy. Weeks turned to months, months to years. Their names slowly disappeared from the lips of newspapers and gossip. The same people who once roared for their blood now barely remembered they existed. Some of these women, once fierce and defiant, began to wither inside. Their bodies weakened from thin prison gruel, their hair turned dull from lack of sun, and their eyes grew distant. They began speaking less and less, as though afraid their voices might echo back and remind them how empty the world had become. Others tried to cling to some fragment of who they were. A few carved small maps on the stone walls, tracing the routes they had once sailed. Some hummed old sea shanties until the guards grew irritated. A rare few even plotted escape, though the dream of freedom felt more like a cruel joke with each passing season. And yet, the cruelest twist was not the suffering, it was the erasure. Governments did not want pirate women remembered as bold or rebellious, so their trials were not preserved in detailed records. Their portraits were burned or hidden. Their names were quietly removed from naval reports. It was as though history itself was trying to pretend they never existed. So they rotted away in silence, unknown and unvisited, until one by one they simply stopped waking up. No hero's grave, no marked stone, just a line in a prison ledger. Deceased. A few were released after decades, old and unrecognizable, set loose into towns where no one remembered their names or their crimes. These women wandered the edges of society, begging for work, some ending up in poorhouses. To the world they were merely strange old women with sea scars, never known as the fearsome captains they had once been. Their final punishment was not the noose. It was being forgotten. The quiet tragedy in the end, the tragedy of executioner families, isn't that they were feared. It's that they were never allowed to be anything else. They were born into a cage they never built. They inherited a punishment for crimes they never committed. And they carried it silently, while the world pretended not to see them. They were the children of the gallows, living proof that sometimes the shadow of the axe falls not just on the condemned, but on the hands that hold it, and the hearts that love them anyway. The vanishing fortunes of the sea queens. When female pirates were finally captured, their bodies were taken in chains, but their possessions became the real battlefield. Governments, rival captains, merchants, and even their own crews all lunged like starving wolves toward the wealth these women had gathered. And this is where the story of their downfall takes an unexpected turn. Because while their lives ended in silence, their gold, jewels, ships, and artifacts lived on, scattered across empires, swallowed into treasuries, melted into coins and buried so deeply in bureaucratic paperwork that their names disappeared from it entirely. This was the second execution they suffered. The execution of their legacy through plunder, the first wave of seizure. The state descends like vultures the Yi. Moment word spread that a pirate woman had been taken alive. The Navy or colonial authorities acted fast. A special legal term existed for this: prize goods. Anything seized from pirates could be claimed by the crown. But these prizes were not simple crates of gold. Female pirates often had far stranger collections than their male counterparts. When captured, the belongings were inventoried with obsessive detail. Court documents from the 17th and 18th centuries describe chests filled not only with coins, but bolts of silk from China, carved ivory from West Africa, strange medicines from India, and letters written by merchants, lovers, and fellow captains. All of it was hauled into evidence rooms, though much quietly disappeared before ever being recorded. Customs officers were notorious for pocketing jewelry and trimming gold off ingots before weighing them. It was whispered that even judges slipped coins from confiscated chests during trials. For the crown, the main goal was simple: erase the pirate's identity and convert her treasures into state wealth. In many cases, entire ships were auctioned off within weeks. The sails that once bore the roar of cannon fire were stripped, replaced, and sold to respectable merchants who scrubbed away their bloody history. Crew betrayal and the silent scramble, while governments stripped away the obvious loot. The crews of these pirate women often betrayed them in quieter, deadlier ways. When a female captain was cornered or captured, many of her crew scattered like frightened birds. They fled with armfuls of plunder, abandoning her to trial and death. This sudden disintegration meant much of her personal wealth: secret stashes, coded maps, lovers' gifts, even weapons, simply vanished into black markets. Taverns in Kingston and Port Royal buzzed with rumors of pirates selling off rings said to belong to captured women captains, or rare silks still marked with the insignia of their ships. But because society refused to believe women could be real pirates, most buyers never even recorded their names. The myth of nameless pirate queens was born here, not because they lacked names, but because their betrayers buried them. The fate of their ships, from war machines to ghosts, perhaps the greatest possessions these women lost were not coins or jewels, but their ships, their floating kingdoms. These vessels were more than wood and sail. They were carved with personal symbols, painted in colors meant to terrify, armed with cannons salvaged from wrecked men of war. Female captains often customized their ships to suit their strategies: faster rigging, hidden weapon compartments, even disguised figureheads to confuse enemy lookouts. But once captured, these legendary ships were dismantled like carcasses. The navies of Britain, France, and Spain often stripped the ships for timber and armaments. Cannons were reassigned to forts. Masts were reused on merchant vessels. Even the figureheads were sawed off and sold at docks. Sometimes a few ships were kept intact, renamed, repainted, and turned into coastal patrol ships, ironically used to hunt down other pirates. One haunting detail appears in scattered naval logs. Years later, young sailors would unknowingly serve aboard ships that had once belonged to the very pirate queens their admirals had executed. They swabbed the decks where those women had once stood defiant, completely unaware. The ships lived on, but the women were erased from them. The legal theft, courts of admiralty, and secret auctions after. The chaos of immediate seizure came the legal plunder. Captured pirates' possessions were put through admiralty courts. Here, judges didn't care who the pirate was, only which government had the right to claim her loot. These trials were long, technical, and deliberately designed to strip any personal identity from the property. Once condemned, the goods were sent to auction houses. Wealthy merchants bid on them with icy detachment, never mentioning the women who had once risked their lives for them. Gold coins were melted into standard bullion bars. Exotic fabrics were cut into fashionable gowns for noblewomen who never knew they wore the spoils of a pirate queen. Precious stones were reset into crowns, sword hilts, or dowries. In a chilling sense, these women were absorbed into the very system they had rebelled against. Their treasures became symbols of the power they had once defied. The vanishing of personal artifacts. Among the saddest losses were the personal items, keepsakes that carried their human stories. Journals, letters, charms, childhood trinkets, portraits, lovers' tokens. These were rarely valued in courts. Many were tossed into storage and later discarded, burned, or stolen. This is why historians struggle today to even know what many female pirates looked like. No verified portraits survive of most of them. We have only hostile descriptions from their captors: wild eyes, unkempt hair, unnatural boldness, words chosen to shame, not to remember. It is as though the system wanted not just to kill them, but to erase the idea that they ever existed as full human beings. When treasure became legend, the rise of pirate myths, ironically, this erasure helped give birth to some of the most enduring pirate legends. As the tangible evidence of their lives was destroyed, their stories became ghostly, mutable, tales told in whispers, embroidered with fantasy. Sailors claimed that some women had buried their treasures on secret islands, waiting to return. Children grew up hearing bedtime stories of the lady captain who will come back for her gold. Treasure hunters in the 1800s searched the Caribbean for their hidden hoards, finding nothing but coral and wind. The truth was far less romantic. Most of their wealth was simply stolen by courts, corrupt officers, or traitorous crew. But the legends thrived because they gave people hope that something of these women had escaped destruction. In a strange way, myth became their last refuge, how their wealth changed empires. It's easy to forget that pirate loot wasn't just shiny objects, it was power. And when these women were captured, that power didn't disappear. It was absorbed. The gold they seized from colonial treasure fleets went straight into the treasuries of the very empires they had fought. Those coins funded wars, built forts, and paid the salaries of the officers who had hunted them. Some of their captured ships were sold to merchants who used them to expand trade routes. Silks from their holds ended up in the wardrobes of queens. Medicines from their captured cargo inspired early apothecaries. Even the maps they had drawn, stolen from rival navies, quietly advanced imperial cartography. In a cruel twist, the rebellious energy that had driven these women across the seas was converted into the fuel of the systems they had tried to escape. They became invisible architects of the very world that had destroyed them. The final disappearance, paper shadows, once the treasures were gone. Even the paperwork began to vanish. Colonial bureaucrats had little interest in preserving the records of women who embarrassed their empires. Many court files were deliberately misplaced, burned during wars or allowed to rot in damp cellars. Others were rewritten to erase the female name entirely, crediting her conquests to male lieutenants. By the 19th century, most of their treasures still existed, but completely detached from their names. A ruby in a duchess's ring, a ship's mast in a merchant vessel, a gold bar in a bank vault, all originally seized from women whose names were now dust. It was the perfect erasure. Their lives ended on a scaffold or in a prison cell, while their wealth lived on forever. But as someone else's, the silent victory of the system, and so the fate of these female pirates' possessions tells perhaps the darkest truth of all. They lost more than their lives. They lost their stories. Their ships were scrubbed and repainted, their gold melted down, their clothes cut apart, their keepsakes discarded, and their names crossed out of ledgers. The world devoured them completely and left no bones. The system that feared them most did not just kill them, it consumed them. It turned their defiance into profit, their rebellion into raw material, their freedom into fuel for empire. And that is how history ensured that the pirate queens of the past became invisible. Not by burying their bodies at sea, but by burying their legacies on land. The silence after the storm, how the world forgot the pirate women. When the hangman's rope tightened and the crowds drifted home, a strange quietness fell over the names of the captured pirate women. The cannon smoke cleared. The flags of empire fluttered triumphantly. The courts patted their ledgers closed, and then, as if on cue, the world forgot them. This forgetting wasn't sudden. It was slow, creeping, deliberate, like barnacles slowly covering a sunken ship. Layer after layer of silence buried these women until their faces faded from memory, their names from maps, and their voices from the sea winds they once commanded. The first burial, their names were removed. The earliest erasure was bureaucratic, cold, calculated and quiet. Colonial officials, still uneasy about the public shock these women had caused, moved swiftly to seal away the scandal. In an age when gender roles were rigid and sacred, the idea of women commanding warships, defying kings and spilling blood on the open sea was a humiliation to the moral order. So they began to disappear them. In execution records, their names were sometimes replaced with phrases like a woman pirate or a certain wench. In naval logs, Captains referred to them simply as the prisoner, without mentioning their sex at all. In court archives, entire trial dockets were filed under their male accomplices' names, with their own reduced to footnotes or scratched out completely. One colonial clerk even scrawled a chilling note beside a captured female pirate's name: "Best to omit her, lest others imitate." And so, even as the public cheered their deaths, the record keepers quietly began pretending they had never lived. The social erasure. Women could not be remembered as warriors. The second stage of forgetting came from society itself. 7th and 18th century culture simply could not tolerate the notion of women as professional criminals or military leaders. Women were supposed to be symbols of purity, obedience, and domesticity. So when some had dared to become sea captains and raiders, the culture reacted like a body rejecting a splinter. It pushed them out of the story. This erasure took many forms. Taverns stopped retelling their tales. Instead of singing about the lady captains, balladeers wrote new songs about male pirates. Even when they borrowed actual exploits from female captains, they changed the names to men. Newspapers mocked or downplayed them. If they were mentioned at all, they were described as unnatural, mannish, or hysterical, so that readers would view them as aberrations, not heroes. Painters and illustrators erased them from images. Engravings of pirate battles removed their likenesses entirely, showing only men on the decks where they had stood. It was as though society had made a collective decision. Women could not be warriors, so any woman who had been one must be forgotten. The moral erasure. They were rewritten as monsters or lovers, as their real lives were buried. Fictional versions began to replace them, twisted caricatures created to fit the moral expectations of the age. In pulp novels, morality tales, and sailors' yarns, the women pirates were recast in two roles. The temptress villain. She was shown as a seductive witch of the seas, luring men to ruin with her beauty and sin, only to be justly destroyed by a noble navy captain. The tragic lover. She was shown as a foolish girl who only became a pirate to follow a male lover, and who died of heartbreak rather than defiance. Both tropes stripped them of their real power and agency. They became side characters in their own stories, accessories to men's dramas, rather than leaders of their own. By the early 1800s, nearly every mention of real female pirates had been reshaped into these moral fables. Their defiance had been completely defanged, and instead of being remembered as revolutionaries, they were reduced to warnings about what happened to bad women, the geographic erasure. Their graves were lost to the sea. The bodies of many pirate women vanished as completely as their names. Some were executed and buried in unmarked graves near gallows sites. Others were hung in iron cages called gibbets as public warnings, their bones left to rot over the harbor until storms tore them down and waves carried them away. A few who died at sea were thrown overboard, sewn into sailcloth and weighted with cannonballs, standard naval practice. The sea swallowed them, and no memorial stones were ever raised. Centuries later, when archaeologists searched old pirate haunts, they found the wreckage of their ships, but almost never their remains. It was as though the ocean itself had conspired with empire to erase them. The academic erasure. History books refused to see them by the 19th century. The forgetting was nearly complete, sealed by the authority of official history. As universities rose in Europe and America, historians wrote grand narratives of naval empires, trade routes, and piracy, but they did so through a deeply male gaze. Women simply did not exist in their maps of the past, except as wives, widows, or victims. Even when evidence of female pirates stared them in the face, they dismissed it. Trial transcripts were called rumors. Eyewitness testimony was labeled exaggerated. When two women, like Anne Bonny and Mary Read, were undeniably documented, scholars treated them as freak exceptions, rather than as part of a broader hidden tradition. This academic blindness hardened into canon. Generations of schoolchildren were taught about Blackbeard and Calico Jack, but never the women who fought alongside or even outshone them. The erasure was now complete. They were gone. The long silence, 1800s, 1900s, a century without their names. The 19th and early 20th centuries were the darkest age for their memory. For over 100 years, most of the world believed there had never been such a thing as a female pirate. Victorian society, with its obsession for gender propriety, sealed their coffins even tighter. Children's pirate books showed only men with beards and parrots. Museums collecting pirate relics threw out items if they suspected they were linked to women. Newspapers reporting on treasure hunters mocked any suggestion that pirate queens had ever existed. Even when women's rights movements began rising in the late 1800s, they rarely mentioned pirate women. Activists wanted respectable heroines. Suffragists, scientists, writers, not bloody-handed captains. So the world sailed on without them, century after century. The ocean forgot their voices. The maps forgot their roots. The history books forgot their faces. The first sparks of rediscovery, mid-1900s. And then, quietly, something extraordinary began to happen. In the mid-20th century, a handful of curious scholars, archivists, and amateur historians stumbled upon anomalies, traces of forgotten women in old pirate records. They were often accidental discoveries. A dusty court ledger in London that mentioned a female mariner tried for piracy. A ship's log from Jamaica that described a woman among the crew who fought fiercely. A set of letters in a merchant family's attic referencing the lady, captain who plundered our convoy. At first, these finds were dismissed as curiosities, but the fragments kept appearing, enough to hint at something much larger buried beneath the surface. Historians began asking forbidden questions. What if these weren't freak accidents? What if women pirates had once been common and were simply erased? The rise of feminist maritime history. The real turning point came during the feminist scholarship wave of the 1960s-70s. A new generation of women historians stormed the archives with fresh eyes, determined to recover the lost stories of powerful women. And when they turned their gaze toward the age of sail, the silence around piracy began to crack. They dug through Admiralty court records, colonial port ledgers, Navy muster rolls, prisoner transport manifests, private letters between merchants and governors, and slowly, painstakingly, they began to reconstruct entire hidden lives. They proved that many female pirates had disguised themselves as men for years at sea. Others had led crews openly but were erased after capture. Some even captained multiple ships across decades, yet were remembered only as nameless brigands in old naval reports. These researchers gave the women back their names. They published books, journal articles, and biographies. They held academic conferences on women and piracy, shocking traditional historians. The forgotten captains began to reappear like ghosts rising from the waves. The modern resurrection late 1900s today. In recent decades, the rediscovery has accelerated. With digitized archives, international research collaborations, and DNA analysis of shipwreck remains, historians are uncovering more about these lost women than ever before. Universities now offer courses on gender and piracy. Museums mount exhibits about the lives of Anne Bonny, Mary Read, and others. Popular history books and documentaries explore the hidden world of women at sea. Feminist writers and artists celebrate them as symbols of rebellion, resilience, And freedom. Even mainstream media has joined the resurrection. Novels, films, and games have begun portraying pirate women as complex leaders instead of side characters. Their voices are rising again, faint but growing louder after centuries of forced silence. Why this rediscovery matters recovering. Their stories is not just about filling gaps in maritime history. It is about challenging the machinery of forgetting itself.